Hi, welcome to Blogging Heads TV. My name is Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and I'm your host, and you're watching Culturally Determined. And my guest today is Mya Byrne. Mya, could you introduce yourself?
Howdy, how's it going? I'm a musician from New York and a writer and trans advocate.
Great. Well, thank you for coming on today. And I should say that we've known each other for a number of years.
A number of
Um,
years. I've known you since you were, what, 10, 11?
yeah, so
I was
probably
your,
about two decades.
I was Aryeh's babysitter as a kid.
um, so I wanted to have you on today to discuss um, Caitlyn Jenner and kind of the media reaction to that and the larger issues
Yes.
of the in the trans community that have been brought up by this story that really kind of took took the media world at least by storm last week. So, I mean, what do you think of how this story has developed?
Well, I think first of all that the problem with the Kate Jenner story, and it's not that it we've seen sensationalized trans women who are of means or who are not people of color for a really long time. Um, and and the thing is, people are like, "Oh, it's so revolutionary." I'm like, "What? You didn't realize that trans people existed before a white Republican person came out publicly?"
Mm-hmm.
And the truth of the matter is that I really respect the fact that Kate Jenner wants to use her transition to help other people. One of the problems that we've seen with her putting herself out there is that, unfortunately, a lot of the tropes that are constantly thrust upon representations of trans people, specifically trans women in media, are all coming up again. And whether it's the preview for Kate's new show, which literally shows her putting on makeup and talking about makeup in the first 20, 25 seconds of it. That's, that's not what we are. We're not makeup,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a constant trope. And you'll see it if you go back and look at a lot of the coverage of trans people over the years. That's the first thing they do. And when I saw the preview for the new show, I was like, Kate, why? That said, I'm proud that she went on the cover of Vanity Fair and declared herself in a very
Mm-hmm.
public manner. But more to the point, it's hard as a trans advocate and as somebody who lives at the margins of making money. It's really hard to see that when I'm constantly and my colleagues are constantly fighting for equality and justice. People have been complaining a lot about how Kate Jenner, oh, she's getting to spend all this money and blah, 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 blah. I'm like, okay, yeah, that's her agency. She's allowed to do that. But it also illustrates the lack of access that so many trans women have to these therapies, which the medical associations, the APA, the AMA, all agree that there should be unfettered access to trans health care, which includes any kind of gender affirming procedures, whether it's a nose job or getting your brow fixed because you went through the wrong kind of puberty and for trans women, or whether it's other stuff, or just hormones, or just basic health care. It's something that isn't being talked about. Trans women are second-class citizens, and the truth is that the story of Caitlyn is a wonderful one, but at the same time, it's brought out a lot of the negativity, both in the press and in individuals. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that comes both out of fear and ignorance and just the old trope of sensationalizing trans lives and reducing us to nothing more than men in drag, which is a real, real, real big problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it seems like she is the first really prominent person who was in the public eye to transition. Maybe there were a couple people before that, but someone who was, explicitly famous for many years, and then had this reality show fame. And so maybe this was kind of inevitable that the critique that you were having that whoever was going to be the first person to kind of to come out was going to be a notable person, and notable people have influence and are usually affluent and can do things that the average trans person maybe couldn't do or wouldn't have access to.
Well, the thing about it is, though, certainly Caitlyn is a very famous person, but like I said, since 19, if you go back to 1952 and when Christine Jorgensen transitioned, and newspapers picked up on the story, and she came back to this country, it was front page news, it was newsreel news, it was just as much of tabloid style coverage,
Mm-hmm.
and it was the exact same thing. It's been the exact same thing, and the real problems of trans women are not talked about. And
So
I,
what are some of those problems that the media is doesn't cover?
well, first of all, there's a we are attacked. Specifically, trans women of color are attacked and beaten and killed at an extraordinary rate. The lack of access to healthcare is a huge problem. In Until very recently, there was no trans coverage since about the 80s, and that came in most insurances, and that came during something that happened during the Reagan era, when the first gender centers opened in the 60s and 70s, this wasn't questioned, and it was covered by insurance, and it was because of specifically of a woman named Janice Raymond, who is a person we call a trans exclusionary radical feminist, or a TERF, which these people consider a slur, but these are people who literally don't think that trans women are women, and this is, I'm paraphrasing slightly, but this is a quote from Janice Raymond's book, basically saying that trans women rape non-trans women by appropriating their bodies. And then this woman was contacted to write the new Medicaid laws in 1985 by the Reagan administration.
Hmm.
So what we're dealing with is systematic oppression. And the problem is that because of the media representation of us, there are, with the exception of one movie that came out this past year, Boy Meets Girl, there has never been a mainstream film that depicts a trans woman played by a trans woman
Mm-hmm.
in a leading role. Only in very brief supporting roles. And then there's a dichotomy between the people who are sort of in the mainstream LGBT movement and are accepted or have put themselves out there. And certainly they've helped a lot of people, but over the years. But then you have people like me. I identify as a lesbian, and then these people don't, and they basically take the side of these trans exclusionary radical feminists, and they say that they put a dividing line between women like me who are attracted to other women and women like them who are heterosexual, which is just another example of both heterosexism rampant in the upper echelons of the wealthier white trans community, and also these stories that are willing to be covered.
Mm-hmm.
One of the interesting things about the Kate Jenner story is that she has identified as asexual, which is not a common thing. So there are good things and bad things that are coming out of this, but what non-trans people aren't seeing are the comments that we see every day. And one of my friends just wrote, the Kate Jenner thing has made me so tired of trying to explain why it's problematic, because I would have to explain why I'm tired of explaining why it's problematic. Um, it's hard to deal with, and when we're fighting to be seen, and then you have a high-profile person who gets seen, the other thing that happens is that it creates an element of anger in people who are bigoted against us, and I think we've been seeing that in a lot of newspaper articles, which I know you want to discuss, and just on the street. Um, with more visibility, unfortunately, comes more attacks, and for years, trans women were told to be silent, to hide themselves, to hide their pasts, in order to gain access to these medical therapies that we need. That's changed a lot since 2001, when Callan Lord and other medical organizations have basically wrote new guidelines based on informed consent for trans people. Before that, and to this day, in a lot of places that aren't major cities like San Francisco or LA or New York or Chicago, you still have to do all this gatekeeping, and the gatekeeping laws were written by white heterosexual doctors, and they would determine who was able to access healthcare basically by how much somebody could pass is the term that people used. I'm a woman, and that's fine, and I'm visibly trans and I'm openly trans, and that's a good thing. Part of the other problem with the Caitlyn Jenner thing is that while I understand the feeling of not wanting to come out until you physically feel ready to, because that's certainly what I did. I wasn't ready to come out until I had reached a certain point of my transition. Of course, I'm a public figure to a lesser extent. That was important to me, but I did that not for any reason except my own comfort. I don't think Kate's doing that for any reason except her own comfort either. But the problem is that the way it's being portrayed right now is that people, especially feminists of a certain age, see this beautiful woman presenting herself on the cover of Vanity Fair and saying, I'm a woman and I've always been a woman, and people who are our parents' age, our parents are both baby boomers, they fought tooth and nail to not be determined by the forced femininity that was put upon them as children, and they railed against that. Because of that, femininity has been discounted and diminished over the last many number of years. And since the 70s, especially in the queer community, it's been hard for people assigned female at birth to accept the fact that some women are feminine, and not to devalue that, whether they're cis or trans. Whereas women who are
just to define cis for people who don't know what that means.
Cis, okay, so cis is the opposite of trans. It comes from the Latin, and cis means aligned. So a cisgender person is someone whose gender as assigned at birth agrees with their own personal gender identity, and gender expression, of course, is different than that. You can be a cisgender person and do whatever the hell you want in terms of wearing clothing and how you present. I have short hair, and that doesn't make me any less of a girl because I have short hair. But 20 years ago, if I wanted to get health care, and again, in some places today, if I walked into a doctor's office looking like this with no makeup on and said that I'm only attracted to women, then I wouldn't be able to access the health care that I wanted, because these doctors didn't want to produce people like me. And now we're coming out and we're trying to get visibility, and what happens is the same old tropes are just repeated over and over and over and over again, and it's awful.
So why don't we talk a little bit about this TERF acronym, Trans Exclusive Radical Feminist, is that what it stands for?
Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminists.
Okay, thanks. So there's a piece that was in the New York Times that was currently the most emailed article,
which is really horrible to think about.
So it's by Eleanor Burkett. It's called What Makes a Woman. I'll just read briefly an excerpt from it, and I'd like you to respond to it. So she's writing about transgender women. She says, their truth is not my truth. Their female identities are not my female identity. They haven't traveled through the world as women and been shaped by all that entails. For me and many women, feminists and otherwise, one of the difficult parts of witnessing and wanting to rally behind the movement for transgender rights is the language that a growing number of trans individuals insist on, the notions of femininity that they're articulating, and their disregard for the fact that being a woman means having accrued certain experiences, endured certain dignities, and relished certain courtesies in a culture that reacted to you as one.
And again, that's the problem. The thing is that by reducing trans women, by reducing, okay, by reducing the being a woman to bodies and certain experiences, not all women menstruate. Not all cis women menstruate. There are plenty of women who have, AIS, which is a syndrome in which you don't have a womb.
Hmm.
Gender and sex is not so binary, and having a period doesn't determine whether or not you're a woman. And certainly I respect the experiences of women who came before me, but and there certainly is a dichotomy between the experiences of trans women and the experiences of cis women, but the expectation that and the implication that my womanhood and my is not as valid as theirs is frankly a load of so much bull caca. And it's really problematic too, because it's just terrible. I think I think a lot of cis women are threatened by the fact that um, that trans women not only are insisting on being included in the conversation, but are trying to make it very clear that as women, we're possibly the most discriminated group, and it's very, very difficult to get that across to anyone. And so Eleanor Burkett said, I recognize and endorse the right of men to throw off the mantle of maleness. And so just by saying that sentence, you've diminished me, and you've said I'm not really a woman, because you've said that I'm a man. I was never a man. I thought that I was supposed to be a man because that was what, that was just what I didn't, some people know that they're trans when they're kids. Some people know that they're trans when they're adults. But the whole thing is problematic, extraordinarily problematic. And
Well, let me just pick up on something you just said, because that's a question I had, and forgive me if maybe this is a bit of an offensive question. What referring to yourself as always a woman. I mean, how do you understand that? When did you realize that you were transgender, and were you? Is that when you became a woman? Were you a woman before then? You just didn't
well,
realize it.
here's the problem: is that people think that life is linear, right? That you're this one thing, and then you become it, and then you just break off and you become another. That's not how transness works. I have a song called "Lost Angel" on my new album, and one of the things I talk about is how I'll just recite the lines. It's like, she was a child, grew up beside you, a mirror hoping you would see through, all your days running from her sweet face, so much like yours when your fingers traced. There are parallel lines. I grew up, and this was always in the background. That being said, because of my body and the way my body developed, which is a quirk of, just that was just a quirk. I couldn't really testosterone. We talk about testosterone poisoning. A lot of trans women do, and so that's the whole point. Is that it's really important to realize that people, just like Kate Jenner said, she didn't become a woman. She was a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And when you realize your gender identity, and you're also in a position where you're not sure what to do about it, and there aren't positive role models, because again, until very recently, there have, and still to this day, most trans role models are sensationalized. You don't quite have the words to put to it. And then the notion that there's the notion of residual male privilege is really terrible. The truth of the matter.
Can you explain what you mean by that?
People talk about there's a concept that trans women are literally being told to shut up right now, and that's a problem, because these women who and they are mostly women, unfortunately, who rail against us in press, and all of the TERFs are women. They insist that we have residual male privilege, and there's an article that, and it is actually really offensive to the trans community, that a trans woman named Jillian Page wrote in the Montreal Gazette yesterday, and it basically says, trans people don't get that. Every time they shout down and drown out a natal female voice, they come across like club-wielding men. And so it's sort of like being a self-hating Jew. It's like these are people who, and there are a lot of them. There are people who are trans women who take the side of these people, and it's a huge problem. But that's the whole problem, is that people are these people who fought so hard to rail against patriarchy in the 60s and 70s during second wave feminism are using the language of patriarchy against us by saying that we should not be heard, that we should sit in the corner and be silent. Mm-hmm. And that I'm not trying to silence anyone. I want people to listen. And that's why I write articles. That's why I'm talking to you right now. And the problem is that I'm not going to discount anybody's experience who went through who's being female. We get harassed. All women get harassed constantly. All women have to fight every single day. The concept of residual male privilege is terrible, because as you transition, I say to a lot of people, one of the gifts I've gotten from transitioning was the gift of watching male privilege disappear, and because of that I have a very unique perspective of seeing how masculinity is not only foisted upon people but valued, and how devalued femininity is. And that is just a constant especially on the side of so-called feminists. They don't value the fact that a lot of people celebrate their femininity. Why shouldn't I celebrate my femininity? It's just as strong as masculinity, and it's a whole lot less fragile. And it's a huge problem. We are being silenced, and then the few voices that get out there are the voices of privilege.
Mm-hmm. Well, if we can shift to talking maybe a little bit more about your personal story.
Sure.
So, like I said, we knew each other years ago. Mm-hmm. When did you realize that you were transgender? Like I said, I didn't really have words for it until a number of years ago, about 5 or 6 years ago. I really understood that on some level I was trans. I had listened to Anthony Hegarty of Anthony and the Johnsons, and that band, incidentally, is named for Marsha P. Johnson, who was one of the Stonewall veterans, who was a trans woman of color who is said to have thrown the shot glass that was heard around the world. She was one of the first people to resist the police. But so Anthony was on either one of the local NPR stations here in New York, and I was in the shower, and I was listening to her talk, and I realized that the experience that she talked about mirrored my own. Now, certainly there had been times in my life that I had questioned my gender, I had played with gender, and I'd expressed myself in all sorts of different ways, starting as a child and keeping it very quiet because there was a great deal of shame. Because again, I grew up in the Phil Donahue era, so it was just like, oh, my wife is really a man. So it's like, again, no role models. But it came out a lot when I was a younger person. I never found anybody in my personal life who affirmed that, or a community that affirmed that. Because, again, it's very hard for trans women to find each other, because we were literally told for many years to go into hiding. And a lot of trans women don't talk about being trans, or aren't open about being trans, because it's dangerous. Right.
and it can be dangerous, especially in certain places. So about I don't know. So again, I listened to Anthony talk, and I accepted the term for myself I used was spiritually transgender. And even though I had said to partners in the past in intimate times, I think I'm a woman, or I am a woman, or I thought that maybe I'm a girl, or, and then things would come out the way I would express myself. I always had long hair, or like acted a certain way, and I was never quite one of the boys, but I was never really like, but I also tried to embrace huge, like macho masculinity.
Hmm.
Um, I my former partner and I both sort of came to terms with our gender while we were together, and I realized something was wrong. I had accepted my queerness, which I was closeted about being queer for a long time, but it just, nothing felt right by saying that. And then the concept of being spiritually transgender, or basically living a more androgynous life, didn't really jive, and I couldn't really figure out what the problem was. And I had been thinking about a lot of this and starting to play with gender again, and um, my aunt suffered a stroke in 2012, and I was at her apartment taking care of it while she was in the hospital. And there had been all this deep sadness, and I'd started to go to therapy because I was really depressed, and I wasn't sure why, but I kind of knew why, and I wasn't really sure. I had expressed myself as being genderqueer, which genderqueer is a term for someone who has basically a non-binary identity. And sort of like a lightning bolt, I was leaving the apartment one day, and she lived on the top floor, so there was a skylight, and this bolt of light hit me in the face. And all of a sudden, right in front of me, clear as day, I saw myself transitioned. And of course, I'm a musician. I saw myself having transitioned, this tall, beautiful woman with long hair and a gardenia in my hair, singing one of my songs on the stage of the Ryman Auditorium, the home of the traditional home of the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville. And I started to cry, and I just said out loud, "Oh my God, I'm a woman."
Wow.
And
So that was almost like a epiphany, or like a spiritual
yeah, it was a
moment.
spiritual. It was for me. It was.
Hmm.
And and in that moment, I realized that you know I kind of had the Field of Dreams voice in my head, just saying, this is not only who you are, but advocating for other people is what you need to do. And while it took a long time for me to become comfortable with the concept of transitioning, and even just and living my life outwardly as female, which was really difficult to do. It took me a number of years. I didn't come out till 2014. I didn't start transitioning chemically until 2013. Um, I I detransitioned for a while in that period because it was just too much to handle. It's a lot to handle, and a lot of
Hmm.
people detransition while they're starting to transition, as Caitlyn Jenner has spoken about, and as other people have spoken about. They started therapy and then they stopped. But at a certain point, it just all made sense. And then one of the interesting things about being trans for certain people, and again, I can only speak for my own experience as a trans woman, and for some trans women have different experiences than I. But once I started taking hormones, it was like, oh my God, it's like putting high octane fuel in a turbocharged car instead of low grade no name gasoline. It was like, oh, I'm running. I function, and
Hmm.
everything became better.
Hmm.
Everything became right, and my body changed, and I went through puberty again, and I went through it the right way, and I feel so comfortable and so happy in my body. And then, but more important than that, it's like my soul's at peace, and I'm able to express myself musically, artistically, and as an advocate in a much deeper and much more honest way. And when I say honesty, I'm not saying that I was not telling the truth about myself before. I'm just saying that I'm able to express myself and express who I am completely. And it's not that I had secrets before, it's just that there was this part of my life that I didn't know what to do with.
Hmm.
And it was a very scary concept to try to bring that out. And I was really scared to come out publicly because I didn't know what was going to happen. And thankfully, my community has very much embraced me, both personally and professionally. And I'm very lucky because a lot of people don't get that. And but again, I'm a person of privilege. I have a mom whose house I'm currently in because I'm moving to San Francisco tomorrow, and I'm just holding up here for a couple of days. And I have a credit card, and I have some equity, and I have things I can sell if I need money. There are so many trans kids on the street who don't have the kind of support that I have, and what's most important to realize with a story like Kate Jenner is there are 500,000 queer kids who are homeless right now, kicked out by their families, shunned by their friends, who will maybe make it to a big city, um, and when they get here, like in New York, there's only like one shelter specifically catered towards one or two shelters specifically catered towards trans people, and like each of these facilities has like 15, 20 beds. They have a waiting list a mile long. Thousands of kids every night want a place to sleep, a place to eat where they won't get harassed, where they won't get raped. So, I'm really, really lucky, and
Hmm.
I count my blessings, but while my trans experience is mirrored by many people's, it again isn't representative of so many.
Right. I wanted to ask a little bit more about being a musician and
Yes.
this process as a musician, and you were performing before your transition, and how do you see your artwork changing? And I mean, you talked about honesty before. Do you think there's things you were holding back
It's
in
interesting.
your music before the transition?
Yeah, it's not even that it was deliberately holding back. Like there were times when I could really let go, and especially in the studio when I was alone. Um, what's been really interesting about coming out is that music is it's more like when I was a child, and I had started to play. Music flows through me, as opposed to for when I went through what I think is called second puberty, when people who are assigned male who produce testosterone. I After I was like 19 or so, things, even though I was always active as a musician and working really hard and somewhat successful, it was always a struggle to get through to really get those notes out. It was like uber concentration. And I'm not saying I'm not concentrating as much anymore, but the music is just coming out of me in a much different way, and people notice it. I played a concert yesterday, and the last time I played this concert series was before I transitioned. And the first thing after the show that the host said to me was, "Oh my God, I just don't understand." But it's like, it wasn't about, it was so related to my transition, but she was saying, your music, your guitar playing, it's just amazing. You've just grown so much. And what's funny is I don't feel like I've grown per se. I feel like there's not a block, there's not a physical block because I'm not fighting my body anymore. I'm not fighting
Hmm.
this piece of my mind and my heart that is saying this isn't right. This isn't who you, this is, this life you're leading is not all of your reality. I had to
Hmm.
embrace the feminine person who grew up beside me and integrate that into my musical life. And it's paid off in dividends. I was really scared to come out, and the truth of the matter is that I thought I was going to be completely rejected by my music community, and again, it's been the best thing I ever did for my career, which is amazing. I got an email, and then all of these other art forms that I practice that I hadn't been doing. I mean, I wrote a book of poetry, which sounds very hoity-toity, but I got an email early this morning from a conference down in Miami. It's a trans art conference, and they're like, "We just want you to know that we came across your poem, Irises," which was published in The Advocate and also in a magazine of a poetry group I belonged to last year. And they're like, "We think it's an amazing poem, and we're going to sit, and it's going to be a major point of discussion at our conference." And I get emails from people saying, "Your writing and your music, it moves me, trans people and non-trans people alike." And while I've gotten so much great feedback about who I am as a musician in the past, I feel like this has enabled me to exceed the potential that I thought I had as a musician, to exceed to exceed and excel. And it's not just that I have my own confidence and I think I'm a badass, but people say that to me, and that's really humbling, and it also reinforces the choices that I've made. And the choice was not to become a woman. The choice was to acknowledge the fact that I was one and that I needed to transition. And that was my agency.
We're probably about coming to the end of our time.
Sure.
I had one more question, and
Please,
you could,
yes.
if there's anything else you want to say before we end. The question would be, what would people who want to consider themselves allies of the transgender community, what do you think they should be doing?
The first thing is, if you really want to be an ally to the trans community, humble yourself. I mean, you have to. And I know that sounds harsh, but it's the truth. Go on to GLAAD's website. You can just Google GLAAD Transgender 101 or how to be a transgender ally. There's tons of resources out there. Respect people's pronouns. Practice their pronouns. If you have someone trans in your life and they're changing their pronoun and they're changing their name, literally walk around your apartment or your house for 10, 20 minutes a day and say, like for me, I said to a friend of mine, I'm like, "Hey, Maya's pronouns are she and hers. Maya's pronouns are she and hers. She went to the store." And people are going to make mistakes. It's okay to make mistakes, but don't try not. It's dangerous to misgender people in public. Respect people's determination, even if they don't appear the way that you think they should appear. Respect their self-definition. Respect their identity. And work hard on, ask yourself, why does this bother me? Why is it so hard for me to do this? Why is it so hard for me to shift? Why is it so hard for me to support somebody? And one of the interesting things about being trans is that it's like the emperor wears no clothes. It's like a lot of trans women become radical activists because we, on a very personal level, see the subjugation and the oppression in this world. Listen to us. But the most important thing you can say to a trans person who decides to come out to you or who's part of your life is to say, "Hi, how can I help you? What can I do for you? How can I support you?" Ask them what they need from you, because coming out to someone, it's really hard. It's hard, and it's also a time of great joy and a time of great discovery of yourself. And it's not uncommon for people who are first transitioning to focus on their own physical appearance, which is natural. We're having all this joyful feeling about, oh my God, this part of my body that I didn't know, we were numb to it. Don't get down on people because they might be like, "Hey, do I look okay?" Like I for the first 6 months of my transition, I was like, do I look okay? Can I go outside? Can I do this? Can I do that? Can you see this? Can you see that? And it's hard because some people think, oh, this person's just become self-obsessed. No, that's not it. It's simply that we are finding ourselves. So have compassion, have understanding, and understand that there are things that we want to share with you. And there are also things that are private, and there are things that I can't possibly help you understand, but there are bridges to empathy that can be built. And there are lots of ways to do that. If you can recognize the oppression in your own life and somehow relate it to mine and say, okay, well, I don't really understand what you're going through, but I've experienced this and it's bothered me on this level. Is that in any way similar to what you're going through? Start a conversation. Don't tell people what to think, because a lot of people tell trans people how to think, how to act, how to define themselves. That's not the way to build a better tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else you'd like to touch on before we close out this conversation?
I want to say that it's really important to listen and to seek out the voices of trans people of color. It's important to protect the trans people in your life by any means necessary, and it's really important to understand that to silence us or to not listen to us is just abhorrent. We need to be heard, and the reason a lot of trans people are outspoken is because we've been subjugated for so long. And with the advent of the internet and more coverage in media, we are being more present, we are being heard, and there are a lot of people who are angry, there are a lot of people who are scared, and nobody's trying to attack anyone. In my opinion, we're just trying to get fair representation, and unfortunately a lot of the representation that we're seeing in the media and the reaction to it is not representative of average trans lives. So think about that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, Mya Byrne, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It was a really interesting conversation, and I learned a lot. And we will include links to your musician page and articles you've written and anything else you would like us to link to in below this video. So thank you for coming on.
That's my pleasure. You take care. Say hi to your brother and mom for me.
I will, thanks. Bye. Bye.